Take your seats. The front seats are the best ones. They're bigger. I've placed them there. They're slightly better. Okay, we can take our seats. We're just waiting for Tam. I think she's just arrived. As soon as she steps in, then we're going to start. Andreas, you can take your seat. Tucker, you can take your seat. Mel, you can take your seat. Oliver. Dylan is Tam out there. I'm just waiting for Tam to step in. In fact, I think we can start. So welcome to our social on a Wednesday. For those that don't know, we have a social like this every first Wednesday of the month. So you can be guaranteed we're going to have it. We try to do a small, before a main event, we try to do a small 10 or 15 minute event. And today we have exactly that combination. But I wanted to remind you just of this slide and also to remind you about donate.mcsa.app. Feel free at any point when you do a meet or any other event and you feel an appreciation for the club because of the great work that we do, donate to the club. The club really is a non-profit, but it needs money to do the things that we want to do. In terms of property and conservation, we always are desperate for money. So feel free at any point in time. You don't have to wait. If you feel like, yeah, I love the club, donate to the club. Please do that. I want to show you just a quick thing, because not everybody might be aware of this. If you go to our meets calendar, and you go to our website, and you can just Google MCSA Johannesburg, and you go to the events or the meets calendar, you will see the meets, and you'll see these little things at the side here. I've highlighted the social media one, so that we can see what we're doing. Every Wednesday there's something. I've just confirmed today in September we'll have Warren Eva to present his Annapurna Ascent. So it's going to be another great one. And we have a really big one like that every first week of the month. You can also, of course, click on any one of these, like sport climbing, trad climbing, mountain mats, kloofing, hiking, conservation. Just see how they all pop there. You can look at these events like that in timeline, or you can look at it in calendar format. So if you want to know what we do, events calendar. I think it's time. Let me quickly see. Okay, it's too late. Before Darragh is going to step in, we've got Peter Gordon coming from Bushveld Mosaic to talk to us about conservation in action. He's got 15 minutes and then we're going to go over to the main event. I'm going to bring up your presentation, Peter, and then you can be off.
No. Oh, okay. I don't know if I can juggle everything in my hands. Okay. Good evening, everybody. As Benny said, my name's Peter. I'm just going to say my thank yous now, so I don't, because I'm told I'm going to get kicked off if I talk too long. So thanks to Benny and Dylan for basically organizing and giving me an opportunity to come and do a little bit of selling. And when we talk about conservation, effectively that is something, sorry, can I also just introduce Andre? Andre is also from Bushveld Mosaic, is one of the people on the team. And its conservation is close to our heart. But what we really are is a training institute. And I'm just going to talk about these 5 points, and I've got hundreds of slides, so I'm going to flick through them very quickly in order to get through this in time. So basically, who are we? Bushveld Mosaic, as I say, it's a training institute that basically started way back in 1995 and has been running very successfully since 1995. We were originally, I don't know how many people know about Pilanesberg, but there's a group of volunteers at Pilanesberg called FOPS, Friends of Pilanesberg, and the training side was originally part of the FOPS organization, but way back in just after 1995 or around that time, it was felt that basically there was a need to focus on proper training that would basically train up people to become honorary officers in Pilanesberg and to do volunteer work with an emphasis on knowing the bush, knowing what was going on, knowing how things interacted with each other. So we started in 1995. Basically, today we are the main intake or the main learning facility for the honorary officers at Pilanesberg. Again, I don't know if anybody has been to Pilanesberg. If you go over the weekend, there's always 6 or 7 people driving around with park official signs on them who are all volunteers, and basically 99% of them have actually come through Bushveld Mosaic. We also basically work with wildlife enthusiasts, so if you're an enthusiast of wildlife, the bush, you love the bush, this is basically the course for you. We do for youngsters. We now do have some youngsters that actually want to become proper trails guides, and they can do the course, and then they write the FAGASA, or the Field Guides Association of South Africa. They write their exams through that and then become fully qualified field guides. All these little abbreviations, we always like abbreviations. NWP and TB is Northwest Parks and Tourism Board. So we are recognized, we actually are the only recognized training facility for Northwest Parks. FAGASA, Field Guides Association of South Africa. So we are a recognized delivery partner for them. So that, as I say, if you do our course, you can basically write your FAGASA. And CASITA is the government training institute, which is basically in the process of falling apart or dying, or something else and getting replaced. All right, so that's us. As I say, we've been around since 1995. We've basically every year we run a course, and we are fairly successful, I believe. The honorary officers, as I say, if you've seen them over the weekend, have all come through our training school, and basically they volunteer at Pilanesberg. Our philosophy is to create a body of informed people with a balanced view of conservation. So we'll talk just now about all of the modules that we do in that, but basically we focus on trying to get a full picture of nature and a balanced view of it, rather than basically any kind of slant towards anything or any one way of looking at things. I mean, there are so many controversial topics as far as conservation and nature go now. We try and basically come up with some kind of a balance through this whole thing. And we provide comprehensive instruction and guidance around wildlife, the protection of wildlife, the protection of the land, etc., all with basically qualified people. that's our background. I mean, basically, as I say, it's an attempt to get people somewhere between, we normally have somewhere between 15 and 20 odd students a year, and it's to just get those people thinking, getting them involved in conservation, and get them moving along a path that basically will help protect all of this for our future generations. So what do we do in this year that we're talking about? Effectively, the course is a part-time course because a lot of people are still working. The people that we do, as I say, we focus more on the mature, should we call it mature person rather than the youngster, although we do have youngsters. But it's a part-time course. More or less once a month there's a weekend. So we start on a Friday evening and finish on a Sunday. The course basically runs, Friday evening is your test time, so we write tests on all the modules. It's certainly not Mickey Mouse. You have to do tests, you have to write things if you want to become FAGASA qualified. So we do that on Friday, Saturday and Sunday morning through to Sunday lunchtime is basically practical. We run our modules, as I say, once a month in either Pilanesberg, Geswani, or Borokalala. So I don't know if anybody knows where those other parks are. But Geswani is just outside Rustenburg, and Borokalala is about 60 k's the other side of Brits. So they're all Northwest parks, and we go and we camp in privileged areas. We basically have, in Pilanesberg, we stay inside Potawatomi, so we're inside the actual game reserve. In Borokalala, we have our own honorary officer campsite, which is away from everybody else. So they are privileged areas. And then we have a year-end function, which is coming up right now because our year runs from July through to June, not January to February. So basically our new course is actually starting next month. We do have some Saturday lectures, so things like reptiles and amphibians and that you don't really see if you go into the bush. Rather than basically spending the whole weekend, we just do a Saturday lecture, and those take place in Pretoria at Freedom Park. So that's basically our structure. These are some of the modules that we present. I've got another slide that goes through a lot more of these, but basically this is just to give you some nice pretty pictures so you can look at. And that is one of the things, if you're, and Andre is a special example of this, if you are into photography, the opportunity to take pictures on these courses is amazing. I mean, you're in the bush and you're spending the full weekend camping and that. So all of the pictures in this slide has either been taken by my brother or myself. So there are lots and lots of photographic opportunities should you be in the bush. Our tutors, or the people that, so on each weekend or on each module, we have a lecturer and then a couple of coordinators that help with it. All of our lecturers are experts in their field, all of them, excepting when I do one. But this, I don't know if anybody knows Ulrich Uberprela, who's written a whole lot of books on birds and things like that, is actually a South African renowned birding expert. Ulrich, I mean, you learn more and more and more every time you go. It's amazing what you can learn. So it is a learning experience of a lifetime, no matter what your age is. You gain new knowledge all the time. As you can see from basically all the modules that we cover, it's a comprehensive program. Those modules all run in an order, so they actually build on each other. You learn one, and the next one builds on the previous, so it's the whole year is integrated, learning as a learning program rather than just individual modules. As I said earlier, basically all our lecturers know their topics, and some of them are world-renowned lecturers, basically. You will certainly meet new friends. It's one of definitely one of the benefits of this is to meet other people that have the same interest in nature and the same goals. And you will have fun. There's some hard times and you have to work quite hard at it. I'm not going to kid you. When I did it, I thought, oh, this will be a breeze until you actually start working. But there's lots of fun times, getting around a braai on a Friday night with new people, as I say, that basically have the same thing as you. It's an amazing experience. It's an investment, basically. What you get, so I'm told, when this slide was put together with it's an investment, I said, what's it, an investment? And I'm told, in actual fact, that investment is a marketing term for what do you get out of what are you putting in. So these are the kind of things. You basically get lecture fees. So all of our lecturers get paid. You get course notes, worksheets, portfolio files. All the park entrance fees are paid or included in your tuition fee for the year. So basically, once you've paid the registration and tuition fee, which is 1,000 or 16,500 for the year, the only thing you're really committed to then after that is effectively your petrol to get there and back over the weekends and your food and drink. So that 16,500 is basically the total cost of the course for the year. You will not find another course at that price, trust me. And the reason for that is, as I said earlier, our lecturers are basically people that are totally committed to teaching people and trying to encourage people to get into the bush and learn and conserve things. And our coordinators, everybody, myself, Andre, everybody else that runs it, we're all volunteers. So basically, none of us have a profit margin or profit driven. The organization is a non-profit organization. So that's why we are able to basically keep the course costs down to that. These are some testimonies from previous students from 23. We actually changed, why these are only from 23 is we changed our calendar year. We used to run from January to November, but we changed to run from July to June, so we had a half year that we skipped. So basically, but I'll leave you to read those. There's no point in me reading for you. But these are some of the students that we've had last year that have now all become honorary officers. So if there are any questions, I'm quite happy to basically take questions. I can go back and talk on things. I was a little bit conscious of my time limit, so I did speed through it a bit. But if there are any questions or anybody's interested in joining Bushveld Mosaic, as I say, we're starting. So our first introduction morning is Saturday the 19th of July at Freedom Park. And effectively we then start the week after with the taxonomy and ecology weekend. I've got some brochures and cards here that I can hand out if anybody wants them. They have mine and Andre's contact details on them, so you can basically get everything from there and contact me and we can get going. Yep. Oh, so Etienne is a past.
I've done the course myself. It's an excellent course. I really recommend it. And it's a very good stepping stone if you want to get involved in nature conservation, become an honorary officer. But you don't need to become involved. If you just simply want to do the course to gain knowledge, know which tree this is, or grass or butterfly, whilst hiking and climbing, you can just do that as well. So can be done like that. I know even people who haven't even written exams, they just enjoy the course and they gain knowledge.
Thanks, Etienne. Yeah, this is why we actually asked if we could come and talk to you, because trust me, and I'm not a lawyer or a doctor, but trust me, when you're out and walking, if you're going hiking, if you're doing climbing, the knowledge that you will learn just to start looking at different grasses, looking at different trees, understanding how they interact together, both the biotic and abiotic facts that make everything in our unbelievably complex world work together. You will learn. And yeah, I don't want to undersell the work, but yes, if you're not interested in writing tests, if you just want to come and learn and spend a good weekend, we also cater for that. Done. Thank you,
I
Betty.
think we're out of time, but I mean, it's great what you do, and I can imagine, you know, being out in the field and knowing a bit more about, you know, the wilderness and the bushveld to actually appreciate it more.
Super.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Damn, it's just in time. If anybody wants to ask questions, are you going to be around until afterwards? We're going to be an hour. Yeah, it'll be great if people can still ask you questions.
Do I have to stand anyway? I do have to stand in a space. Hello, everyone. I'm Tam Scheidegger. I'm here to introduce Darragh Woodford. And this is actually a great honor for me to be able to be standing here and introducing you, Darragh. I've had some lovely long travels all the way through to Dome often and different venues where we've done quite a bit of weeding. Darragh's become quite one of our avid weeders because he gets the opportunity after our 2-3 hours worth of work. He gets to relax and take his camera out and dip into the pool. So many of the photos, I'm assuming, that we're going to see actually come from some of our conservation meets, where he has taken many of these amazing photographs of our indigenous animals, and I think I'll leave the rest of that to Darragh to explain for us. And this is a bit weird, because usually if you are doing anything where you're needing to learn about something, you do the theory first and then you do the practical. But in actual fact, I've done the reverse. And we had a lovely practical where earlier on this year, I think it might have been in February, where we actually did it was World Wetlands Day, correct. And we actually did a snorkeling tour of the pools in Dome, and Darragh annotated us through that. So we've actually already done the practical, and now there's going to be some reinforcement on the theory. So over to you, Darragh.
Thanks very much, Tam. Yeah, so when I was asked by Benny to give a talk on the fish in the Magaliesberg, I immediately turned around to him and said, that'll give me about 20 minutes of material. And he said, no, but I need at least an hour. So I've spent the last week trying to come up with what can I tell you, lovely folks, about what I do and what I'm passionate about that'll last a full hour. And I realized the only way to do this is to actually give you a little bit of a guided tour through my career as a fish biologist and focus in on not just the Magaliesberg, but the many rivers that I've been working with and working around in the last 10 years since I've come up here to the savanna, because there's some incredible rivers in the savanna which are worth thinking about and worth protecting. And one of the key things that I've discovered that allows us to protect them is this concept of biosphere reserves. So the main thrust of this talk is hopefully going to be getting you to understand how important biosphere reserves are for protecting our freshwater ecosystems. So to kick things off, it's good to start with who am I? So I am an associate professor of aquatic ecology at the University of the Witwatersrand. I've been there for 10 years now. I am also a lifelong mountain stream enthusiast. So I've loved mountains and I've loved streams that come off those mountains for a very, very long time. And that's basically what's driven my career to this point. I'm also an occasional angler. I used to be a much more obsessive angler, but since my career has moved on and living in a city like Joburg, the options aren't as easy to come across anymore time. But I have enjoyed many great fishing adventures, and that's been a lot of the inspiration that's got me to where I am. I'm also very much a conservation advocate, and I'm always looking for ways to spread the word of how we can protect our freshwater streams, and hopefully you'll get some of that through this talk in the next little while. So if we want to talk about my journey to get here, we have to start with when I first discovered what fishing was, and that was a long, long time ago. So I was extremely grateful to my mother digging up this picture of, I think I'm either 5 or 6 years old here, but learning to fish for the first time. And this is a really important picture because it represents me in an environment that was fundamental to my being, which is the Upper Olifants River catchment in the Achterwitzenberg Valley in the Western Cape. We had a family friend who owned a farm in this valley, and I would go there from when I was about 2. We'd go every couple years, and there'd always be hiking in the fynbos, there'd always be fishing at the dam, and I learned to fish there, and I learned to love rivers at this area. We managed to go back many, many times, and even myself into adulthood managed to go back to this same dam through the years, as well as exploring the Olifants River itself and doing some fly fishing for the trout that lived there. So very much fishing was where I first got into rivers. However, things changed quite dramatically in 2002 when I was doing my honors degree at UCT. So I was doing a biology BSc honors, and there was a guy at Cape Nature, a guy called Dean Imson, who was looking for students to do projects on fish. And everyone knew I was the fish guy. I was the one who was obsessed with fishing. So me and my best mate, who were both fishing obsessed, we both put our hands up and said, yes, we'd like to do fish projects. And the project I was assigned was to look at the impact of rainbow trout, which is a non-native species, on indigenous fishes in the Upper Berg River. So this is the river that comes off the mountains just south of Jonkershoek, in the sort of, just south of Franschhoek in the wine-growing area there, flows north through Paarl and ends up on the west coast. But in the upper reaches there was trout. And my job was to figure out if the trout were doing any damage to the native fish. And then I was told that to do this, I would have to spend 3 weeks fly fishing to collect trout, to figure out what was in their stomachs, including sampling in places where your average angler was not allowed to go, as you can see by that wonderful sign. So that was great. And then also snorkeling to see the fish, count the native fish, and see if there were any spatial interactions between the native fish and the alien fish. So 3 weeks of fly fishing and snorkeling, and I get to call this work? Sign me up! And that was basically where I became a fish biologist. And what was brilliant about that was that I also managed to complete that study and ended up getting it published in our local South African freshwater journal, together with Dean Imson from Cape Nature, and this was my first ever scientific publication that came from that little honors study. So that set me on the path to become an actual fish scientist and not just a fishing enthusiast. My MSc was then also at UCT, and this time I was in the Cederberg. So back in the Olifants, the same catchment where I grew up fishing, but this time in the Cederberg itself, in a beautiful little river called the Rondegat. Those of you who know the Cederberg, it's the stream that goes through Algeria campsite and goes down into Clan William Dam. It's that river. And this is actually just downstream. Ooh, that image is just downstream from, is this thing going to work? That's about 2 kilometers downstream of Algeria. So that gives you an idea. And that's where I was learning how to use an electrofishing machine for the first time. So this is where you zap the water with electricity to catch the fish. And the main thing I was doing, again, it was alien fish, native fish. In this case, I was trying to understand whether this alien North American species, the smallmouth bass, was having a negative effect on the native fishes, in particular the Clan William yellowfish, which is this lovely specimen here. They get to about 1 meter in length in the big rivers. So they're very impressive. And so what I found with my study was we looked at the sizes, the difference in sizes of the yellowfish in the upper reaches where there weren't any bass and in the lower reaches where there were bass. Basically, there was a waterfall barrier. The bass could only swim up to that barrier. They couldn't jump it. And so below the barrier was bass zone, or the invaded sites, and upstream was the non-invaded sites. And this is basically a frequency distribution graph which shows the sizes of yellowfish we got upstream versus downstream. And you can see upstream, lots of juveniles, lots of fish between 5 to 10 and 10 to 20 centimeters. Downstream, most of the fish were bigger than 20 centimeters. So the bass were basically eating all the baby fish, and there was zero recruitment happening in that lower part of the river. So again, we could demonstrate a definite impact of predation by this invasive species on the native fishes. So then my life took a really interesting turn, and I got to spend 4 years in the wonderful nation of Aotearoa, New Zealand, for my PhD, which I did at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. And this is basically became my laboratory for 4 years. So this is the Broken River in the Waimakariri catchment, and it's the Canterbury High Country, so you've got some very typical landscapes. You've got the mountains, which are all formed out of the sort of schist and grey-wacky sandstone, very, very unstable, break down into scree slopes all the time. Then you have your typical beech forest in the lower reaches and the sort of grassland, scrubby area, which is what the landscape is like, and then these beautiful braided rivers full of gravel flowing through them. And what I was looking at here was, again, a group of native fishes. These are called the galaxiids. So there's many species in New Zealand. This one is the Canterbury galaxius. And again, trying to see what the impact of our old friend, the rainbow trout, was on these endangered species. And so my project was a landscape scale project, trying to understand not just what happened in a particular site, but across the landscape. And what we found was that there was a real spatial interaction between where these populations of galaxias that occurred in refuge streams above a waterfall that the trout couldn't penetrate to, and where they could co-occur with the trout in that landscape. So what we could see was that once you were in the invaded sections of the river, the further downstream away from a waterfall you got. So that's what the x-axis is here, is the distance downstream from the nearest trout barrier, the less galaxiids were surviving in the river. So your biomass basically dropped precipitously as you got further and further away from the waterfall. So what we are seeing here is that the trout are eating the galaxias all the time, but they are getting what we call demographic rescue, immigration coming from above that waterfall to replenish those stocks. But the further away you get, the less likely it is for those fish to replenish those distant populations. And so you get basically a demographic sink happening in the landscape. Now, that wasn't all I did while I was in New Zealand. I didn't only work, I also tried to have a lot of fun, and so I did a lot of chasing of extremely large trout in extremely beautiful landscapes, particularly places where I'd gone for work first, so I kind of knew where the big trout were hiding. And so when the angling season started, I could sneak back to those pools which I'd spotted before and pull some really nice fish out of those holes. So that was really wonderful. The other thing I did, and I would be totally remiss at a mountain club meeting not bringing this up, is that I did quite a bit of hiking, or as we say in New Zealand, tramping. And some of that tramping got very close to our chairman's definition of mountaineering. So here I am at the peak of Avalanche Peak, which is a mountaintop above, right by the central divide of the Southern Alps, which is the big mountain range that runs down the spine of the South Island of New Zealand. Mountaineering isn't really what I was doing, because for that in New Zealand you generally need crampons and a pickaxe, but I was still at the top of a very high mountain, so I think that counts. But you can just see a really lovely dramatic landscape that you can find in the South Island of New Zealand. But most of my time was spent further down in the lowlands. Oh, just to point out, the cool thing you can find up here is the world's only alpine parrot. So this is the Kia, and it's a really inquisitive bird which can be extremely destructive if you let it anywhere near your hiking boots. So do not take your boots off when there are Kia around. You will lose them and they will be destroyed. But as I say, most of the time I spent down in the lowlands exploring these beautiful rivers that came off these mountains and exploring the fish that were in them. When I came back to South Africa, I managed to do a postdoc in the Eastern Cape, and really my career had been set in motion now, where I was focusing on this question of alien invasive fishes that we as humans bring into countries as sport fishes. So we bring them in for our own entertainment, our own joy, but they cause havoc on the local environment. And most of the time I was working with either the rainbow trout or this one here, the largemouth bass. These fish have been in South Africa for an extremely long time. So they've been in here, in the case of the rainbow trout, since 1895, which was when they were first introduced. And in the case of the largemouth bass, they were brought in 1934. And there is an ongoing debate in this country as to how we deal with these fish. In the case of trout in particular, there was an ongoing legal fight over this because they were actually placed in the NEMBA regulations, the National Invasive Species Lists, but then a bunch of fly fishing human rights lawyers decided to take the government to court to remove trout from that list. And that's something that's still under legal review about 10 years later. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom for the environment, because at least in the Western Cape, we started to get some really good interactions with the local angling clubs, and we managed to convince at least the bass anglers that it was not a zero-sum game. We could remove bass from some areas and keep them in others where the bass anglers actually like to fish for them. And this really, a great example of this was back in the Rondergat, the same river I did my master's. We managed to organize a bass eradication program. Cape Nature managed to rehabilitate the river by removing the bass, and we were able to see the native fish recolonize that stream. And that was all done with the support of the bass anglers, because they were happy for us to conserve fish in a river that they would never fish for bass in the first place, as long as we weren't going to interfere with their prize water bodies like Clan William Dam itself. So this was a win-win situation. We left the bass in Clan William Dam alone, but we managed to save a lot of fish in the Rondergat River. So that then brings me to Johannesburg. And I've moved up here in 2015, but I didn't join the mountain club until 2022, after the pandemic ended. And what I quickly discovered was that there were incredible rivers in my backyard, which I got to start exploring. So one of the first ones I discovered, of course, was the Maratluwani River, where its headwaters are in Castle Gorge. And then, as Tam mentioned, we also explored the wonderful wetlands that occur on the Castle Gorge property, and some of those beautiful ponds that exist in that wetland area, where you find all sorts of great animals, including this very strange bubbling Cassina tadpole that was cruising like an alien angelfish in one of the ponds. A very, very strange looking creature, but quite charismatic. My other favorite place is, of course, Dome Pools and the river that flows through there. Again, some beautiful habitats, this time with fish, as well as lovely creatures like this African clawed frog, or platada. And then also, I discovered another great river further to the west at Mhlabatini. Now, unfortunately, there's no fish here, but it's still a great hike and a beautiful river to swim in. So, worth a try if you've not been there yet. Don't you dare. So, now to get to the point that I was originally asked to cover in this talk, which is to talk about what the fish are that we actually find in Magaliesberg. So this is a screen grab from iNaturalist, and all those little blue pins are where I've taken photographs of fish in the Magaliesberg. And the first one I want to talk about is probably my personal favorite, which is the Marico minnow, or as many will consider, it's the piranha in the piranha pools. So if you've ever been to the top of Castle Gorge and gone to dip your toes in the pool there, these little guys will come out and nibble the dead skin off your legs. That's why they're called the piranhas. But they are wonderful little fish, and they only get to about 6 centimeters in length. That's a fully grown adult. And they are found in all the headwaters of the Crocodile West and Marico systems. But they're headwater specialists. You only find them at the top of the river. They don't go further downstream. So they go all the way to the top of the mountain, but you don't find them further down. We have larger fish in the system. This is the large-scale yellowfish. And these ones can get substantially bigger than the Marico minnow. If you want to see an absolutely massive one here in the Magaliesberg, you need to go down to the Maratluwani Trust property, upstream of the old bush school there. There's a beautiful waterfall with a big, long plunge pool below it. And if you snorkel through there, you can see large-scale yellowfish up to 50 centimeters in length cruising in that pool. So if you can get access, it's a lovely place to go and have a little bit of a swim. We also have another species in the Magaliesberg, but is much less common than the large scale, which is the small scale yellowfish. These are two juveniles, just to show the difference. There's a large scale. You can see it's got fairly large translucent scales. The small scale's got many smaller, much more reflective silvery scales. That's basically what they look like, because you generally don't find the big adults in the mountains. What seems to be the case is that whereas the large scale is kind of resident in the mountain streams, you find the big ones and the small ones here. The large scale, or sorry, the small scale tends to migrate up into the mountains to spawn, but then move back down and spend its adult life in the lowland rivers. So I've only found one large adult once, and it was actually in the Mulders Drift Loop, about 5 kilometers north of Walter Sisulu Botanical Gardens, right where the river goes under the N14 highway there. And that was a big one. This is about 35 centimeters in length. So they do exist, but you just don't find them in the mountains. They're in the lowlands. That's the river where we pulled it out. We electrofished it out of this pool. That's Riverstone Cottages there, if you want to know exactly where it is. Another lovely fish that occurs in the mountains here is the southern stargazer catfish. Now, this used to be called Amphileus uranoscopus, but it's got a new scientific name now. It's currently being taxonomically revised, so we don't know what its new name is. That was its old name. But these are really cool animals because they are quite small. That animal you can see is about 15 centimeters in length, and that's a fully grown adult. So they don't get big. They're quite small, but they are very much mountain stream fish. They tend to live under the boulders and hide away, but where you can find them often is in cascades and waterfalls, where they tend to actually swim up and down the vertical rock walls. So they look like they're climbing the walls literally. They're swimming up and down. And they can physically climb waterfalls. It's hard to see in the image, but on the leading edge of their front fins, their pectoral fins, they've actually got a comb-like bone structure which they can use to grip on the rock, and they can use that to physically climb up the waterfall. So they're really good climbers, and they, like the Marico minnow, go all the way to the top of the mountain. Here's another picture of a wall climbing specimen, and this picture was taken directly behind the waterfall at Castle Gorge. So again, if you want to see these guys in person, take a mask and snorkel and go swim behind the waterfall, and you'll often see them there. A couple other things we find in the Magaliesberg are the cichlids. So cichlids is a widespread, highly diverse family of African fishes, which is most famous for being the fishes you find in the East African lakes in the Great Rift Valley. So Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi. And in fact, Lake Malawi cichlids are very, very popular as aquarium species. And we have two of those cichlid species in the Magaliesberg. We've got the banded tilapia, which can get quite large, but is generally fairly small here. This here is the biggest specimen I ever saw in my entire life. This is a 35 centimeter beast that was in the Mulmani River in the Marico Biosphere Reserve. I've never seen a fish of that species as large as that ever. I couldn't believe it was a banded tilapia when I saw it. And the other species we get here is always reliably very small. This is the southern mouth brooder. As the name suggests, the females actually fertilize the eggs and keep them in their mouths until they hatch, and then even keep the babies in their mouths for a few months until they're big enough to fend for themselves. Now, what's interesting about these species is that unlike many cichlid species where the male and female will pair up for the entirety of the spawning season, in the case of this one, the males tend to jump from partner to partner throughout the season, which is why it has the delightful scientific name of Pseudocrenolabrus philander. That's a knock on the male, I'm afraid to say. So we have a few other species which you won't find on our mountain club properties, but they are nonetheless in the system and worth a mention. One of the more charismatic fishes you'll find in the lowlands is the three-spot minnow. You can see it's got three distinctive dark dashes on its body, and so that's an easy way to tell it from the other species in the system. We also have the widespread and highly ubiquitous African sharp-toothed catfish, which gets much, much bigger than the other little mountain catfish. This one can get to 1 meter in length. It's a Pan-African species. It's found as far north as the Nile Basin in Sudan, all the way down to the Orange River here in South Africa, and all the way along through the Great Rift Valley, all the way between. So a genuine Pan-African species. In South Africa, it's also referred to as the barbel, or the barber if you're Afrikaans. And if you live in certain parts of Johannesburg, you might know it as the Randburg tigerfish. Using a naming scheme, I'm sure, that also gave us the Parktown prawn. Very, very similar kind of naming scheme going on here. And then last fish I want to bring your attention to is this lovely little animal called the short-spined suckermouth. It's another type of catfish, and you can see it has this very distinctive sucker-shaped mouth which allows it to grip onto the tops of rocks and can stay glued to the rock in extremely fast-flowing water, where it also hunts for little insects. It's called a short spine suckermouth because it has this very nasty little spine on the top of its body, which is not only very sharp, but also quite toxic. If you prick yourself, it'll hurt for about 30 minutes. And during that time, it'll not stop bleeding because apart from being toxic, it's also an anticoagulant. So you don't want to prick yourself with these little guys. It's not a fun time. Now, I want to pivot the talk to talking about how we can conserve this wonderful biodiversity that we have in our mountain streams. And this is an issue that I've discovered is really a problem across South Africa because many of our rivers that are of biological significance don't occur inside formally protected landscapes. For example, here we have a classic river inside a national park. This is the Sabi River inside Kruger National Park. But although this part of the river is protected, most of the river is upstream of the park and flows through farmland, urban areas, and rural settlements. And so a lot of the pollution that affects the quality of the water in the park is happening outside the park's borders. And there are very few national parks that were ever designed to look after the rivers specifically. They're mostly focusing on a particular landscape. Now, the one exception to this rule is actually Addo Elephant National Park. So during the early 2000s, there was an effort to expand the boundaries of Addo Elephant National Park to better conserve the particular landscapes in that region. And one of the things they did was to try and capture all the major tributaries of the rivers that were flowing through the park. So the main river that flows through Addo is the Sundays River, and it has several key tributaries which used to be on private farmland, but then got incorporated into the park when it expanded. And in particular, the rivers coming off the Zeerberg Mountains were incorporated into what's now called the Kabuga section of Addo. And by incorporating those rivers, Addo now protects one of our endangered minnows. This is the Eastern Cape redfin minnow. It's considered endangered because it only occurs in streams that flow into Algoa Bay. But now more than half of those are protected because Addo Elephant Park expanded to include those systems for this fish. Not for the fish specifically, but it's one of the benefits of that expansion is that this species is now protected. So here in the savanna, we don't really have a lot of national parks that are in the headwaters of river systems, but the South African government has tried over time to come up with planning strategies to try and at least recognize which rivers should be protected. And one of the planning strategies that came about was something called the Freshwater Ecosystem Priority Areas, or the FEPAs. And this was a mapping exercise that happened in the early 2000s to sort of decide which were the rivers that had high diversity or good water quality that should be protected going forward. And some of them existed in protected areas, but most of them did not. However, biosphere reserves turn out to be one of the ways that we might be able to look at these FEPAs and potentially protect them in a different way. So to show you what I mean, here we have a map of the FEPAs in the Upper Crocodile catchment. So just to orientate you, Johannesburg is down at the bottom here. This is the Crocodile River, so that's Mulder's Drift going into the Crocodile. Here is the Henops and the Yixkay. So the great conurbation of Joburg and Pretoria is sort of around there. And the solid green catchments you can see in this image are the FEPAs, the rivers of significant conservation value. So you've got the headwaters of the Magaliesberg River, just outside the town of Magaliesberg. You've got the whole of the Skierpoort River. You've got the upper reaches of the Hex before it goes into Olifantsnek Dam. You've got the Sterkstrom and the Eerstekloof rivers flowing into Buffelspoort. And you have the Waterkloof Spruit inside Gaswani Nature Reserve over there. So those are the rivers that we ought to be looking at seriously to try and protect them. And if we look at where the Magaliesberg biosphere's borders are, most of those rivers actually fall inside the biosphere. So there is a huge opportunity to use this as a way of focusing on managing those rivers more effectively. So what I wanted to look at was, can these biosphere reserve networks potentially add capacity that's not there from the government to better conserve these freshwater ecosystems? And so to sort of take a step back, we want to sort of explore what exactly is a biosphere and what are the structures that it allows us to look at these rivers. So as a basic starting point, a biosphere reserve is a sustainable land management is made for sustainable land management and coordinated around pre-existing protected areas. So you have a core area which is protected, and then you build around it with other kinds of activities. And we have 3 here in the Western Limpopo. The first to be declared was the Waterberg in 2001, followed by the Magaliesberg in 2015, and then more recently the Groot Marico was declared a Biosphere Reserve in 2018. And these are recognized by UNESCO. They have a program called the UNESCO Man in Biosphere Program, and basically people have to go to UNESCO and propose a Biosphere Reserve, and then if they meet all the criteria, UNESCO will then agree that this should be declared as such, and you get a certificate and you are given the go-ahead to work. So the way that a Biosphere Reserve works is that they must represent a unique biogeographic region for it to be considered a meaningful thing, and there must be room for 3 zones of tiered sustainable development, and I'll get to what those are on the next slide. But essentially, once you have a biosphere in place, there needs to be a management plan that is enacted by a designated authority that UNESCO designates. And in South Africa, we have mostly had biosphere reserves declared where we have regions that have established ecotourism already going on. So for example, in the Waterberg, you've got lots of private game reserves and nature reserves, lots of big game viewing to center that activity around. And in places like the Groot Marico, you have unique places like the Marico Oog, which is this very large, deep dolomitic eye, which you can snorkel in. And so those unique ecotourism features have to be at the core of these areas. And so the way a biosphere reserve is broken up is you have your core, which is normally the areas that already have some form of protection. It could be a nature reserve, a national park, or in the case of the Magaliesberg, we have the protected environment at the top of the mountain, which is still recognized in some form by the government. Then around that, you've got buffer regions, which are not formally protected, but are privately owned land where the landowners agree as part of becoming part of the biosphere to promote sustainable activities on their property, whether that be private game farms or ecotourism, but they basically are all in on trying to be ecologically friendly in the economic activities that they engage in. And then outside of that, you have the transition zone, where you basically don't have any rules for what's going on there, because that is the region for the people who are going to use the biosphere. That is where they live and where they work and where they earn a living. So it's basically the feeder area for the people who are actually going to use the biosphere. So the question then is, do these biosphere reserves actually do a job in protecting these critically endangered headwater streams? There's different ways you can look at this, but the way I approached this when I first started working in this region was to look at it from a river health perspective. So in South Africa, we have several different techniques known as rapid bioassessment techniques that allow us to assess the health of a river based on the biodiversity that occurs there. So we have different models. We have one index that uses aquatic insects, another one that uses freshwater fish. There's even a diatom one you can use. But we focused on aquatic insects and fish to try and get a sense of the health of these rivers inside these biospheres. And what's cool about this system in South Africa is that it's all supported by our national legislation, where our Water Act states that we should be managing our rivers towards an agreed upon standard, what's known as an ecological category. And by using these rapid bioassessment techniques, you can actually determine the ecological category of these streams. And so the way that they work is that you start off with completely pristine or unchanged, which are your A and B categories. You then move into moderately modified by human activity, which is your C and D, and then your critically modified systems are your E and F class streams. So that's like the Henops River, which is basically an open sewer at this point. It's ecologically dead, and so it classes as an EF system. So we went around the Magaliesberg and trying to see where are all the rivers and how healthy are they? So we can see these are all the rivers we try to look at. And I've used, for most of this, I was leaning on my master's student at the time, a lovely lady called Refilwe Chilo. And she did the insect work, and then I was with her collecting fish and doing the fish index. So we managed to get a river health score based on the insects as well as the fish at each one of these streams. So the first one we looked at was the Maratalwani. This is again above the bush school, below that lovely big pool with a big yellowfish lurk. And there we had really good scores for both the insects and the fish, so a very healthy river there. Across at the Easterkloof, we had a slightly modified insect community, which we couldn't quite explain, but again, the fish score was extremely healthy, so that was good. The Sterkstrom was a little bit more modified. We sampled here right at the top of the valley where the cherry orchard is. If you know where Miloro Lodge is, where the road crosses the river at Miloro Lodge, just down there. And it was modified both for the fishes and the insects, and that's because, not only because of the agriculture in the catchment, but also because there was a lot of invasive trees sort of choking the landscape. You can see lots of eucalyptus and poplars, and we think that had a significant effect on the habitat quality of the site, which also meant you start to lose some of your insect and fish species. We also looked on the Highveld to the south of the mountains, and we first went to the Skierpoort, and that was a perfect, pristine system. We got all 9 fish species that occur in the catchment. We didn't miss a single one. And we got an incredibly high diversity of insects there. This is actually at the old Highland Trout Farm, and we didn't see a single trout in the river, but we saw everything else, so that was wonderful. We also looked at the top of the Magaliesberg River. This is at Happy Acres Environmental Education Center, so only about 2 kilometers downstream of the source of the river at Maloney's Eye. And again, very healthy population of both insects and fish there. We also, however, looked at the Kleinrivier just southwest of Headwater, and that river was in pretty poor state. The river there is heavily choked with various invasive plants. The river itself is definitely affected by water abstraction from local farms, so the flows are very low. And the only 2 species we found at the site in terms of the fish were the Marico minnow and the alien invasive largemouth bass, which maybe gives us a clue as to why the other fish were missing from that site. We also looked on the western side. We tried to sample the Hex, but the place we had access to, the river was dry. Again, a sign of the heavy, heavy utilization of water in that catchment by agriculture. And this is probably not even just diversion from the surface, but groundwater extraction for center pivot pumping, which basically means the river doesn't flow except in the wet season. And then further up, we also looked at the Waterkloof inside Geswani. Now this is a bit of an odd one because we sampled for the insects, but we didn't get a very good score, not because the river was unhealthy, but because the river inside Geswani is basically a wetland. And the SAS scoring system that we use to categorize the insects doesn't really work in wetlands. The species it's looking for don't occur in those systems. So it gives you a false impression of how unhealthy the river is. So we need to take that score with a grain of salt. The river itself is in pretty good nick, being completely encapsulated within a nature reserve. But for my student Rafael's Masters, we wanted to take it a step beyond and look at river health across the 3 biospheres in the Western Limpopo Basin. So we sampled, you can see sites in the Groot Marico, in the Magaliesberg, and also through the southern Waterberg there. And again, we were looking at river health to see if the rivers outside the biosphere were more or less healthy than the rivers inside the biosphere. And so this was the general result of our findings. We saw that in all 3 biospheres, we had a good proportion of A or B class, very healthy rivers, a few modified rivers, and a couple of critically modified ones. Whereas outside of the biospheres, we had half of them being moderately affected and half of them being utterly destroyed by something or other, either agriculture or urbanization. So this is a really good sign that actually the rivers inside the biospheres are on average much healthier than the rivers outside the biosphere. So that was a pretty cool result. And just to show what was driving this, one of the things we did was take water quality measurements, and one of the things that came out as a big driver of the negative health we were seeing outside the biosphere was the amount of nitrates in the water. So this is sources of nitrogen, which generally are coming from fertilizers in agriculture or from leaky wastewater treatment works. So both of those things have a big effect on the river health and are resulting in a poor score in the ecosystems we see there. But you can see significantly higher nitrates in the unprotected areas compared to both the Magaliesberg biosphere and the Waterberg biosphere. So what were the take-home messages from this study? The first thing to note was that a lot of these headwaters where we were getting good scores had not just been healthy since the biosphere was proclaimed. They'd been healthy for decades because there'd been private nature reserves or national parks there protecting them beforehand. However, what these biospheres have done is they've managed to maintain that good health by basically fixing in place and not allowing encroachment of development into these regions. And this is something we saw again and again, both in the Waterberg and here in the Magaliesberg, is that these biosphere reserves are under constant attack from companies wanting to prospect for mining. In the Waterberg, it's mostly coal and platinum. Down here in the Magaliesberg is platinum and also quartzite mining as well. But all the time, we find that when speaking to the people in these biospheres, most of what they do, most of their activism is trying to fight off these mining applications to try and keep their ecosystems healthy. And so if biospheres can do that, that's going to have a huge positive impact going forward. It's important to note that it's not always rosy in the biospheres, and we did come across a couple of examples of where landowners who were in the buffer zones were performing water use activities that were not considered sustainable. Here is a weir which has basically turned the river off by diverting the entirety of its surface flow into the orchard. So that kind of thing does happen, and it's something that needs to be kept an eye on. But there are other things that affect these systems that have nothing to do with the landowners. So I might tell you at the end. I don't know if I want to have that on stream.
Okay.
Some of you eagle-eyed people might be able to spot where that weir is. But the other thing is that some of the reasons we had heavily modified streams inside the biosphere was because we were sampling in 2016 and 2017, which was at the height of a catastrophic drought in the savanna. This was at the same time as Cape Town was about to run out of water, if you recall, the infamous Day Zero. So the Palala River, which is this giant main stem river in the Waterberg, basically dried up and turned into these disconnected puddles while we were sampling. So that just indicates how climatic effects that have nothing to do with landowners and what they may or might do on their particular patch of river can still have an effect on the health of the system. I want to also just pivot to talking about how important these biospheres are for general biodiversity conservation, and in particular the Waterberg, because the Waterberg is a really unique area for fish biodiversity. And I was able to find this out because I was part of a large multi-institutional team that went into the Waterberg over the last 3 years to try and assess what the biodiversity of the fish were there. And the Waterberg is unique because it is a very, very large sandstone structure. It's called a massif. It's a giant lump of sandstone sort of plopped into the middle of the bushveld, surrounded by sort of igneous lava rocks where you have all of your platinum and coal. But the mountains itself are made out of sandstone, very much like the Magaliesberg here. And they are unique because they have these incredible crystal clear, very, very low salinity rivers that flow through these beautiful savanna landscapes and have some incredible fish living in them. But they are amazing because there are also so many game farms and nature reserves and game reserves in this area that you not only have these beautiful crystal clear streams with almost no pollution in them, but they also have big game cruising through them at the same time. So it's quite an impressive place to work. This is actually in Valkefontein Game Reserve, where we had this beautiful stream, and we couldn't sample here because we had to wait for the locals to move on before it was safe to sample there. But what we did do is, you can see here, is we sampled all around the Waterberg, both inside nature reserves, which are the green, and outside of nature reserves, which is the orange, to try and get a sense of the fish biodiversity. And we ended up finding 30 different species of fish across that system. This is a mosaic of some of the more interesting ones. One I do want to point out is this wonderful fish here. This is the elephant fish, Marcasinius krameri. It's an electric fish, and it uses a little electric pulse organ on its tail to create its own little electric current, which it uses to detect prey and also to find mates in the spawning season. And we believe that they find each other with their own unique electric song, which they sing to each other through the water. So they're really, really cool little fish. Unfortunately, the other thing we did find was our old nemesis, the largemouth bass. And I'll get to why that's an issue in a moment. But one thing we were looking for was to see, was there any endemism? Was there any fish biodiversity in the Waterberg that was only there and nowhere else? And all of these species we identified were thought to be widespread fish. But my colleagues at the South Africa Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity wanted to take it a step further and did genetic sampling on all of these fish species to see if they might be hidden, or what we call cryptic diversity, occurring in these populations. And one of the species we focused on was this little guy here. This is the short fin minnow, Enteromius brevipinus, and it occurs in 3 different regions. Well, it occurs in the Waterberg, there's a small population in the Groot Marico, and there's also a couple of populations on the eastern escarpment in Mpumalanga. And we compared the genetic samples from the Waterberg to those 2 populations in Mpumalanga using a genetic signal called a barcode. And this is a way that you can potentially tell different species from each other. So the way it works is that genetics tends to, the genetic code of an animal tends to drift over time. So populations will become less and less like each other as time goes on. And there are different models in genetics which say that once they have diverged by a certain number of base points, they are no longer the same species. We call those operational taxonomic units. And this study looked at 4 different models that calculate different rates of divergence to say, okay, now it's a different species. And so we looked at the specimens that we got from the Waterberg and compared them to the 2 populations down here in the escarpment. So we've got the Incomati, which is the type locality for the species where they were first described, and we have the Blader next door, which actually flows away to the north. So they share a watershed, but they flow in opposite directions. And what we saw from the genetics is that all 3 populations were so different from each other genetically that it's quite possible we're dealing with 3 different species. And it will take morphological analysis to look at this properly and assess, do we have both genetic and morphological evidence? If we do, we can potentially describe these new species, which means that we will in fact have a unique endemic minnow that occurs in the Waterberg and nowhere else, which will be a really cool thing to be able to confirm. What we also found, much to my horror, was that there are largemouth bass in the Waterberg biosphere. And in particular, they're in the headwaters, which is a bit of a problem. And this is a problem because we know what these fish can do in the high veld and in the bush veld, because we've seen it before in the Marico biosphere. So back in 2012, 2013, I was part of a SIAB team that went to study the effect of these bass in the Groot Marico, where the bass occur in the main stem river, near the town of Groot Marico. They're in large numbers there. But you have all these beautiful tributaries, these lovely little mountain streams and gorges, which are full of these small-bodied minnows. And we wanted to see what was going on there. And what we found was that there were lots of minnows in these little high-altitude streams, but as we dropped down into, whoops, we go back. As we dropped down into the bass zone, where the bass started to occur, they started to disappear. And if we looked just inside that bass zone and looked at streams where bass occurred and didn't occur below that maximum altitude, we saw that basically the minnows vanished when the bass were there. So that's definitely a predatory impact that's going on. And the thing that's quite terrifying is that if bass, this is what bass can do when they come from the bottom up, when they sort of start in the lowlands and start to work their way upstream. But what happens if they get dropped in at the top? That means they can potentially eat their way down the stream all the way and wipe out all the minnows as they go. And that's the thing that's facing us in the Waterberg. So this is something that obviously needs to be dealt with going forward, but it's a very difficult and expensive thing to do, to try and remove bass from a stream. It was done once successfully in the Ronnegat, but that operation took 10 years to organize and cost over 3 million rand to clear 4 kilometers of stream. So it's a really hectic thing that's not to be trifled with. So there's going to have to be a lot of work done, preparatory work, to see, are there opportunities in the Waterberg where there's a small enough piece of river that would have a big enough conservation impact if we were to actually go in and remove the bass, that it would be worth the money to spend. In the meantime, what I see as the immediate impact that can be done is just to start talking to landowners and explain to them that bass are in fact a problem. Because so many landowners think bass is just a fun thing to have in your pond in the back, and so you ask a neighbor, bring me over a bucket of your bass, and then I can advertise on my website, angling in the pond. When you come to stay at our cottage, there's angling as one of the activities you can do, but that has a consequence. And so, for example, one of the places we saw in our surveys was a little stream where we found bass right at the top of the catchment, and we are almost certain that those bass came from one of these little on-channel farm dams that were immediately upstream. So that's what we need to start getting the message out as to why stocking your dam with bass is not a harmless activity. It has ecological consequences. So where do we go from here with biospheres? What I've learned over the last few years, especially working with Belinda Cooper at the Magaliesberg Biosphere, is that there's not a lot of governmental support for these things. It takes a lot of coordination with lots of volunteers to actually get these things to work, and you need a lot of co-management between the different stakeholders. You need a lot of participatory decision-making between government, landowners, NGOs, and various other people who are interested in helping, and you need dedicated team members to keep it all on track. And someone like Belinda is really, really good at herding the cats and keeping things in line when it comes to this kind of thing. And ultimately, if we can do that, we have the opportunity to actually use these biospheres to manage our aquatic resources as a key asset to keep them, to add value to those systems. And I just want to finish off the talk with an extra slide to say there are opportunities to do this here in the Magaliesberg. And I want to just point out to a wonderful study that Tam and I got to do last year, which was to experimentally remove crofton weed from a river to try and see what its ecological impact was. And we did this with help from a whole bunch of volunteers, both from the Joburg section and the Magalies section. And we got them together, and over the course of a day, we managed to clear out a massive infestation of crofton weed from a stream. You can see the stream finally emerging from the mess over there. And I had an honor student who looked at this and was able to establish that by removing that crofton weed, we not only improved the habitat, but we also boosted the volume of water coming out of the mountain because it had been lost to evapotranspiration through these invasive weeds. So this was volunteer enabled, and it's stuff that we as a club can do to help the biosphere achieve these conservation goals. I just want to thank all the different organizations and landowners who've helped me do the work that I've been able to present to you, the various biospheres, as well as the government agencies that gave me my research permits, and of course the National Research Foundation that gave me most of the money to do this. And with that, I'll invite questions. Yes.
I have a, is it on? Yes. I have a little question about that little sucking spiny catfish.
Yes.
That sucks onto the rocks.
Yes.
And you said that it then can eat the little fish or whatever.
Well, it's insects, so it's an insectivore.
So I'm very curious, does it lever a portion of its mouth up to grab an insect or suck it in, or how does it do that?
I think it sort of just unsucks itself and lands on the insect, kind of like a Hoover.
It's been worrying me the whole talk.
Yeah. I imagine a vacuum cleaner thing going on here.
You talked about trout and bass. Are all the populations self-sustaining, or are they being introduced with fingerlings and stuff to keep them going?
There are still some clubs and institutions that actively stock, especially in Mpumalanga. There's a big trout stocking industry in Mpumalanga. It's quite funny because I do research there once a year. I take my third-year students down to the Elands River, right below the Waterberg and Groot Marico there to sample the river. And I have to get an annual survey permit, research permit from MPTA each year. And the first time I did it, I was given a whole PDF of all the licenses that were handed out that year. Mine was the first one. It was the only research permit. Every other permit on the list was a trout stocking permit for some farm dam or some system, mostly around Dahlstrom, Leidenberg. There's lots of trout farms around there, and they actively stock every single season.
And just a quick one about the carp. I didn't pick up any mention of carp.
So the carp
Say
are
something about
not
that.
fish predators, and most of my work has been done on fish predators. But carp are a different kind of problem because they are what we call an ecosystem engineer. So they are insectivorous, but most of their feeding is done on the bottom, where they tend to grab a mouthful of mud, sift the insects out of it, and then spit the mud back into the water column. So they can turn the water muddy, and that has severe consequences for many of our lowland rivers. In fact, I was in the Waterberg a few weeks ago looking at a section of the Mogalakwena River, and the river is quite clean until it goes below a farm dam or below a dam that's on a campsite, and the river gets incredibly murky below that dam wall, and we believe it's because of the carp in the dam that are churning up the mud there. So they don't have a predatory impact, but they do have an ecosystem impact.
Yeah, so my question is not really one as linked to what you've been saying, but we have exams in a bit. So I just wanted to ask, what's the drainage density for the Magaliesberg area?
I don't have a number for you, but I mean, what we see normally is that there are lots of sort of single tributaries which have sort of dry channels that feed into them. So the drainage density looks quite high when you look at a map. Like if you look at a satellite map or a satellite image, it looks like a lot of streams, but most of them are dry. So the real drainage density is not as much as it looks like from the map. But I couldn't give you a number as to how many individual tributaries there are.
How do you get rid of alien invader fish without harming the indigenous fish?
So it's a very tricky thing to do. Essentially, this is why I say you have to pick your battles. In fact, I did keep one slide back because I thought this question might come up. So I thought I wouldn't have time for it during my presentation, but this is the Rondegat operation. So what this shows is the situation on the Rondegat in 2012 before we poisoned the river with this fish poison called rotenone. And you can see that we had this section of the park, or section of the river that had basically no fish in it. It was all just bass, and then there's a waterfall, and you have these huge densities of native fish. So we poisoned that section of river, wiped out everything. There's a lovely picture of a bass upside down after it's been hit by the rotenone. This is actually the rotenone going in. You can see, I find this so funny because here we have a Cape Nature person whose job it is to do the operation, and she's in a full hazmat suit, and here we have the visiting scientist who's there to observe, and he doesn't care what he's wearing. So that was, I just thought, very funny. But a year later, we went back and saw what had happened, and that whole section that had been poisoned had been completely recolonized by native fish from upstream. So we ended up killing about 90 yellowfish, those big yellowfish that I'd seen in my master's project. They all died in the operation, but they came back, and with them came all these small-bodied minnow species that have been extinct from that section of the river for decades. So you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, but you've got to choose which eggs you need to break to maximize your conservation gains.
I always wonder, those little minnows, right upstream, I mean, the ponds dry out and they come back. How does that work?
So there's dry out and there's dry out, because often what will happen is that the water is not at the surface, but it's just underneath. And a lot of these fish are good at burrowing into the substrate and finding the groundwater and hiding in that groundwater. In fact, I remember a colleague of mine was in the Karoo once, and he was looking for, this is in the Gouritz catchment, so outside of Oudtshoorn, and he was looking for rivers to sample. And he came to a bridge where there was supposed to be a river. There was no river there. But he decided to go under the bridge and see what was there. And he picked up a rock. Under the rock, there was a tiny layer of water and a little chubby head barb lying flat on its side in that little sliver of water under the rock. basically waiting for the river to come back. And so they can do that. They're very, very adaptable. Yeah.
You started off talking about non-invasive trout. What does that mean?
That I might have misspoken. Non-native trout.
Oh, not non-invasive.
Yeah, no,
okay.
all trout are invasive, unless you're a fly fishing lawyer, in which case there's no such thing as invasive trout.
So, I mean, those trout, those are the ones that we can buy at our fishmonger, you know, frozen in the fridge, or you can buy it on the way back down from a trip up north.
So those are normally aquaculture trout. So they've spent their entire lives inside a large pen at a fish farm. They've never actually seen a river in their lives.
And they don't, so what are the ones that are in the river that may have got out there?
So those are the ones that were generally stocked in rivers a long time ago. So, I mean, there was an active stocking campaign throughout the country from the last century until recently. And there are some places where people still get a license to restock sections of river. I know, for example, in the Western Cape, there's the Worcester Angling Club, which is a permit to put like 100 trout fingerlings in a section of the Hex River every year. But that's not a problem because the Hex River gets so warm in the summer that they all die off anyway. So they get stocked and get removed in the same season, basically.
So, I mean, do we not have indigenous fish that are good game fish that you can hunt in?
Absolutely.
That you can fish in the rivers?
Yellowfish. And there was a huge campaign in the 90s to get people to start fly fishing for yellowfish as an alternative to trout. The only thing about yellowfish is that they're not very nice to eat. So they're great to fight and catch and release fishing, but yellowfish is not the same as putting a trout on your plate to eat. So
but bass, is that good to eat?
I think they're delicious. It's quite funny though, because most recreational bass anglers are religious about catch and release. They want to make sure that the fish is still there and bigger than the last time so that the next person can catch them. I used to go fishing in the Eastern Cape and kill a bass for the pot every single time I went fishing. But that's considered anathema in the bass angling community.
You mean they prefer to keep fishing them?
Well, they prefer to, yeah. So they catch a fish and they take a photograph, they measure it, they weigh it, and they put it back in the dam so that the next person can catch that same fish.
A lot of the trout angling guys will say that where the trout have been for generations, they cohabit with indigenous fish, and it's in fact habitat destruction that causes a lot of the issues. Is that a fair argument, or is that just trout lawyers getting an argument in?
So it depends where you are, because sometimes that might be the case, especially in the lowland rivers, but in the upland rivers, there are still places where trout can cause significant damage if they were to be put in. So, for example, there was a species called the Maloti minnow, which was thought to be extinct for decades, and then a comprehensive survey was mounted because there was pressure on Ezemvelo, KZN Wildlife, to declare rivers as trout streams by the lawyers wanted to say these must be dedicated trout streams, so we have the right to stock them with trout in perpetuity. And they went and found this minnow in one of those side streams that had been overlooked for 50 years. And if they had stocked the trout in there, that minnow would have gone within a decade. So you never know. You have to do comprehensive surveys to know what you're dealing with. You can't just state, there's trout in the system, therefore trout can always be in the system. There is, of course, the counterpoint, which is that thanks to climate change, there are less and less rivers in the country that are going to be hospitable to trout in the decades to come. And in many cases, the trout rivers that we have today are going to shrink and move upstream as the climate warms. So trout might not have a permanent stake in this country for too much longer, because they are just not adapted for the temperatures that are coming our way in the coming decades.
Maybe one more question.
How can all this information and all these studies be used to benefit the Biosphere Reserve in their goals?
I mean, it's just about getting the message out there. So, I mean, I was at a workshop recently that Belinda put together of sort of science communication, and part of the idea was working out what the communication networks are that we should be encouraging to try and transfer this information. A lot of it is just basically meetings like this, so just to get the word out. But I mean, I think what needs to happen is just, if we as scientists get an opportunity to work in the biospheres, we need to feed back that information to the biosphere at the end of the study. So, for example, I just finished a study that was funded by the Water Research Commission looking at water quality in the rivers flowing north through the Platinum Belt there. And we presented those studies to the Biosphere Reserves AGM last year. So it's just about making sure that the stakeholders are aware of the research and making them aware of what the implications are, so that when people start to discuss what to do about the management, that the information is available and on the table for them.
Darragh, I have one question. What about a place like Buffelspoort Dam, which is terribly polluted, but I know there's fish there because people are selling it, and I see it next to the road, like huge ones.
We actually don't know. I mean, I think there's both carp and bass in there, but I've never tried to catch them myself. But I mean, Buffelspoort Dam it's not that bad if you compare it to, say, Olifantsnek is a lot worse. So I think in terms of general standards, the dam is not of terrible quality, but the point is that it kind of is an effect on the downstream system. So the rivers flowing into it are fine, but if they are indeed carp in there, then it's going to create a water quality problem that is reflected in the streams downstream.
Yeah, I was actually more thinking about the Hartbeespoort Dam.
Oh, I thought you said Buffelspoort, sorry.
Yeah, I did say Buffelspoort, but I meant Hartbeespoort Dam.
Okay. No, well, Hartbeespoort is that's just a different story entirely, because that's, you're never going to rehabilitate that system while the whole of Johannesburg's wastewater is being piped into it. It's an unsolvable problem, and it's just something we have to manage. And there are various different ways. I mean, there are guys putting micro bubbles in there to try and improve the oxygen, but the fact that you have this constant flow of sewage slurry going in every year, and for as long as Johannesburg continues to exist, Hartbeespoort will continue to be a lost cause. So I haven't much to say other than that.
Okay, I think we can call it to an end. If anybody has more questions, feel free to ask Darragh or Peter afterwards. You talk about such passion and enthusiasm. I think I must get my fishing rod out. I'm inspired. Thanks a lot, Darragh. It was a really great presentation.
Thank
you. If anybody still wants to ask questions about meets coming up, speak to Andreas, our meets convener, or me if you want to. Is there pizza slices left? Yeah, they're down to 10 Rand. And just before you go, they're down to 5 Rand. For lunch tomorrow. And there's coffee. And there's a microwave to heat them up.